Hello, hello. Guess what? We are doing an episode 2. Aren't you proud of us? This is Double Feature Reviews. I'm Libby.
I'm David.
And today we're talking about Gosford Park and Knives Out. A little heads up at the start of this episode. Normally, we want our episodes to be accessible to people who have either seen or not seen the films, or people who have seen only one of them. In this particular case, I think it might be good to watch the films first. Both of them are murder mysteries, so there is information that is being deliberately kept from the audience. So I think even people who don't really care about spoilers, like me, might enjoy them more if you are getting the information from the director rather than from us. And there's also a lot of characters in both of these films, so you might also have an easier time being introduced to the characters as they are meant to be introduced, as opposed to just hearing us talk about them and switching between referring to them by their character's name and by their actor's name.
That is definitely going to happen. Official spoiler warning for Gosford Park and Knives Out now.
Well, maybe not quite yet.
Oh, okay.
Because first we need to talk about the series title. So this is, what do we call this double feature, this pair of movies? What's their name? You go first, babe.
Okay, I'm going with Murder at a Violence Party. So these are both stories about aristocratic families who get together to celebrate the success of their violence-based empire, and then at this very celebration, violence strikes, and one of them are murdered.
Okay, I definitely agree with you on Gosford Park, because they are at a shooting party, and the goal is to shoot pheasants. The party going on in Knives Out is Harlan's 85th birthday party.
Okay, they're there to celebrate the wealth that Harlan has generated as a murder mystery author. So, maybe that's more tangential, but I'll stick with it.
Okay. My title is really better seen than heard, but here we go. Dad, strike through, so the word dad is crossed out. The boss got murdered. Because I think one of the things that these two movies have in common, and one of the reasons we want to do them as a double feature, is that even though maybe one would expect the focus to be on this patrician family and the member of that family that gets murdered, it's actually much more about the servants' experience of this whole event.
Both are, I think, to some extent, upstairs, downstairs drama, to borrow a British term.
Yes. So Gosford Park is a 2001 film directed by Robert Altman, written by Julian Fellows with Robert Altman and Bob Balaban. I'm going to give you as brief of an introduction to the cast as I can.
There are a lot of people in this movie.
It's still going to be quite long. We had to pull almost every single British actor for this film. And I'm going to introduce them in the order that is most logical, but this is not in order of most important or even who appears first in the film. So Maggie Smith is playing Lady Constance Trentham. She has 3 nieces. The eldest is Lady Louisa Stockbridge, being played by Geraldine Somerville, who is married to Raymond Stockbridge, played by Charles Dance. The middle is Sylvia McCordle, played by Kristen Scott Thomas. She is married to William McCordle, played by Michael Gambon. Sir William is the owner of Gosford Park, so all of this takes place at their house. And the youngest is Lavinia Meredith, played by Natasha Whiteman, who is married to Anthony Meredith, played by Tom Hollander, friend of the show. Also at the party is a real-life actor Ivor Novello, played by Jeremy Northam, with his American film producer friend Morris Weissman, played by Bob Balaban. And then in the downstairs crew, we have Lady Constance's maid, Mary McKeithren, played by Kelly MacDonald. Robert Parks, who is Lord Stockbridge's valet, played by Clive Owen. Mrs. Jane Wilson, the housekeeper of Gosford Park, who is played by Helen Mirren. Mrs. Elizabeth Croft, who is the cook of Gosford Park, played by Eileen Atkins. Elsie, the head housemaid, played by Emily Watson. And Henry Denton, Mr. Weissman's valet, played by Ryan Philippe. There are more characters, but those are all the ones you actually need to know to understand what's going on. The rest are all there to be red herrings.
Well, I definitely want to talk about it in a minute when we really get into the analysis of the movie, but one of the great things about Gosford Park is that it knows that you're going to be confused while you're watching it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the story, that Not everybody knows everybody. Everybody is trying to figure out who's who to some extent, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. So now that you know who we're working with, I'm going to throw it over to David to give you a brief introduction to the plot.
Okay, so in 1930s England, an upper-class family of arms dealers, full of secrets, gathers together for a hunting party. They don't really like each other. They aren't very honest with each other, and they barely recognize their hired help as people. As these secrets start coming out, the patriarch, who has all the money, is found dead, and not everyone agrees about what happened or who might be a suspect.
And David is also going to tell us a bit about the production scene and how this film was received.
So the leading creative force behind this movie is Bob Balaban, who, of course, as you just mentioned, is an actor in the film, not the star, but he plays a big role.
He plays a producer, in fact.
He plays a movie producer in the film. And he's most well known as a comedy actor. Mm-hmm. He was in the Christopher Guest mockumentaries, Waiting for Gussman, Best in Show. And he was also worked a lot with Wes Anderson. He was in Moonrise Kingdom and The French Dispatch and several other Wes Anderson movies. So he sort of somehow came in contact with Julian Fellowes. And it was Bob Balaban that introduced Julian Fellowes to Robert Altman, and that's sort of what really got the movie started. Robert Altman is a really successful and acclaimed director. He made like the MASH movie, which was really popular, and also a lot of really cinematic films like Nashville and McCabe and Mrs. Miller. So they started filming in March 2001, and it had one of the most unique filming strategies of any movie in that there were basically no planned shots for anything in the film. And for each scene, they would set up the choreography and then sort of put the cameras around the room and have them move around in a circle looking at all the different actors. And then after the films were shot, they would take this big collection of footage and edit it into a movie. So as a production, it was a lot more like a play than a traditional film, which I guess worked, and from what I've researched, worked really well for a lot of the actors in there who have a lot of theater experience, who have a classical background, don't have to have a master shot and then a zoom in shot and then a panning shot. It all just sort of happened naturally.
And did this style of filmmaking continue to be popular, or is this kind of the main example of this type of filmmaking?
It's not totally unique. There are other productions that have done the same thing, but it is probably the example. Like I said, it has a unique film structure. And I would say overall, the film comes out looking great and really cohesive. It maybe does. When I was watching the movie, I sort of thought, is this like a sports game or some sort of live concert? You can tell some of it isn't all in the same frames per second as other shots. So it does show a little bit. But I think it did a lot to produce a really naturalistic performance from everybody. And the actors talked about how they never knew if they were on camera right now or if this scene or this moment in the scene was about their character or not about their character. So they had to really bring it for every moment and from every direction, which was probably a lot of work, but I think produced some amazing performances. It was the photography for the film began in March of 2001 and it was released in November of 2001. So that's a short filming time and a short editing time and a short marketing time. It was made on a $20 million budget. It made $3 or $4 million in its opening weekend, but it went on to gross $40 million domestically and almost $90 million worldwide. So that's a profit of $68 million, almost 400%, over 400% return. So it was a very successful film, all things considered, commercially. And it went on to inspire the famous series Downton Abbey, where Maggie Smith continues to be Maggie Smith, playing the same character, delivering the same content. She has the Maggie Smith's character in Downton Abbey has to be slightly more relatable and sympathetic because we're with her for like 6 seasons, whereas her character in Gosford Park is pretty much only awfulness in a pretty delightful way. But I would absolutely not want to even be in a room with her. Yeah, she's sort of mean enough that she's not even the villain. She can only exist as a sort of example of a mean person. She can't even bring an evil plot together. She's too busy being mean.
Exactly.
It was a very, all things considered, popularly successful film. And was also really critically acclaimed. It was nominated for a bunch of Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director, which it lost to A Beautiful Mind. And Helen Mirren and Maggie Smith were both nominated for Best Supporting Actress from the film. And it did win Best Screenplay.
I feel like Helen Mirren doesn't have that much screen time in this film. I'd be really interested to see a comparison of like minutes on screen between her and Judi Dench's performance of Queen Elizabeth.
Right.
Because I know she famously got Best Supporting Actress.
8 minutes.
8 minutes on screen. I don't think Helen Mirren's is much over 8 minutes.
Yeah.
It's sort of hard to tell. If you just mean, is she in the shot?
Mm-hmm.
She's certainly there a lot.
Sure.
But there's, as we talked about earlier, there's lots of shots where she is not the focus.
Yeah. What movie was that with Judi Dench? Of course, I know what
Shakespeare in Love.
Shakespeare in Love. Yeah. I'm not a huge fan of the film Shakespeare in Love personally, but I've never had a lot of respect for that controversy. Frankly, I think 8 minutes is more than enough time, and I think she was by far the best part of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Jeffrey Rush was great. Anyway, but yeah, I think it's probably on the lower side, but I think you're sort of making a good point about in this movie. Being in the background does not mean that you aren't bringing a big performance to the scene. That's the whole theory of the film. So it is kind of an interesting case to balance.
And also, I'm guessing no one was nominated for Best Lead Actor or Actress because who's the main character of this film?
Kelly MacDonald.
She's the main character, but Gosh is most of it not about her.
That's a great point. I mean, does Maggie Smith have more or less screen time than Helen Mirren? I think screen time again, but lines? I don't know.
Maggie Smith certainly has more solo screen time.
That's
just
true.
Because Kelly MacDonald's character, Mary, is largely the only audience surrogate. And Mary spends a lot of time with Lady Constance. We spend a lot of time with just the two of them. Yeah.
It was also nominated for art direction and in costume design. Only the win for a screenplay, even though I think the cinematography, the direction might be the better part of the film than the screenplay, which we'll get to it later, but I almost would think that might be true for the other film in this series as well. So we'll come to that another time. It did win Best British Film at the
Bastards? Is that what we're calling?
we did not have to leave that in. It did.
Yeah, at this point in her career, she's won 2 Oliviers and 4 Bastards.
I suppose that's one way to score it. So, yeah, it did win Best British Film at the BAFTAs. And it also won Best Costume Design, which I think that checks out. I don't know. We have a costuming expert here at the podcast. Any comments on that BAFTA win?
So the costumes, this is early 1930s, which is not super my area of expertise, but they look good. They look stylish. The costumes are, discussion of the costume is included in the script. I think Julian Fellowes probably knows a lot about historical costume, 19th through mid-20th century.
Nominated for a lot of other stuff at the BAFTAs, but, didn't get a ton of wins, including Julian Fellowes, nominated for Best Newcomer, but did not win Best Newcomer. I wonder if there's a regret in that. So, Gosford Park was a successful movie. Probably more successful than you might expect when you hear large, mostly British ensemble drama about rich people. People liked it. That's a fact.
Yeah, and you didn't even say murder mystery there. And
That's
I think
right.
One of the most interesting things about Gosford Park is there is a murder. It is a murder mystery. A detective shows up and everything. But I think it would almost even be worth watching even if a murder didn't take place.
Yeah, Robert Altman, during the production of the film, said that people had to constantly remind him that this was a murder mystery. He would be directing a scene and talking about the drama between all the different characters and how it was sort of playing their life. And then an aide would come to him and say, but the murder, this is also something's happening in the murder. He said, oh yeah, and then there's maybe some evidence. And so he would just keep forgetting entirely that it was a murder mystery. So the director of the film agrees with you, for sure.
And now we are officially getting into Gosford Park spoilers. So run away and watch it if you haven't already. So the other unique thing about this film is that the murder victim, Sir William McCordle, is murdered twice. Actually, that might not be a spoiler because that may be the tagline. but it should be a spoiler.
I think it's a spoiler.
Okay.
I think it's a spoiler.
Yeah, he has a knife in his chest, so appears to be stabbed, but it later turns out that he was in fact poisoned. And one thing that doesn't really get covered is that there was actually a third murder attempt, or rather a first murder attempt earlier in the day, where at the pheasant shooting, someone clips his ear, and it's unclear if that was intentional or an accident. But I think by the end we've established that it's intentional.
That's right. So let's back up because there's lots that's going on in the movie.
That's true.
Let's talk about the start of the movie. How does the movie start? So at the start of the movie, Lady Constance, played by Maggie Smith, and Mary McEachran, her servant, played by Kelly MacDonald, show up at this big party at a fancy house. And Maggie Smith walks up and she's greeted by the lady of the house, Kristen Scott Thomas, who asks her, "Did you have a horrid journey?" And Maggie Smith says, "Yes, fairly horrid," which I think sort of sets the tone for her character for the rest of the film.
Yeah, and so one thing that's really well established is like how awful almost everybody in this film is, at least the upstairs people. We have sort of one surrogate nice person in the upstairs party. That's Mabel Nesbitt, played by Claudie Blakeney. Her husband doesn't like her because he has now spent all of her money. Her father owned a glove factory, and now he's stuck with this lower class wife. And even some of the servants are also kind of awful.
Oh, definitely.
And a lot of people get given motives. So almost about half the cast is financially dependent on Sir William, who's sort of the only person in the upstairs group who is working to earn money. Well, not working to earn money, owning a factory to earn money.
Yes. Yeah, everybody's got a lot of problems, and they're dealing with them in pretty selfish ways.
Yeah, and there's also constantly throughout the film close-up shots of bottles that say poison in really big letters. So I think, if you're an astute film watcher and if you're one of those people who really likes to solve the mystery before the script does, you'd probably know that even though he gets stabbed, there has to be poison involved somehow.
Yeah, so I'm not a murder mystery person, so I can't, I wouldn't be around there, be able to collect clues, for sure.
Yeah, I think this one is going to be really hard to figure out, partially because there's just so much work staying on top of all the characters.
Yeah.
That putting the clues together, if you have brain space to do that, congratulations.
Well, as a murder mystery, it's not that satisfying. Mm-hmm. It's not put together in some complex web of evidence that you can play around with and try to deduce the answer. And it doesn't even really try to do that. Mm-hmm. The resolution of the mystery is basically totally sentimental and totally emotional. It's not really a logical thing at all.
Yes. So maybe we should talk about another member of the cast that I didn't mention, Inspector Thompson, played by Stephen Fry, who frustrated David because he is basically the world's worst detective. He's constantly ignoring evidence. When the servants say, "Well, you need to speak to us," he says, "No, I only need to talk to people who really knew the deceased." And he does not solve the mystery. And It's not even like someone else solves it and tells it to him and he sort of takes credit for it in a baffling way. The mystery, from the point of view of the law, never gets solved.
Yeah, the first time I saw the movie, I assumed that the clever inspector would show up and sort of solve the mystery. And so I found myself very frustrated with the film, thinking, how is that going to work? Mm-hmm. How is he supposed to solve this mystery at the end?
Since he's such an idiot?
He's obviously not doing a good job, so they're just going to resolve it where he sort of lucks into the answer. Mm-hmm. That's going to be boring and unsatisfying. And the answer is that he didn't solve it, actually. And, it can lead to whatever commentary you want to have there about police inspection. But I actually found that to be a very satisfying and well-resolved ending in its own way. Mm-hmm. So I got tricked. They got me.
Yeah, and I think also in this film, that's a good thing. Because I think we're sort of rooting for the murderers. Mm-hmm. And there are certainly other films and other stories that can get you to do that. But normally it's because you know who the murderer is fairly early on. Whereas we don't find out. We maybe think it's Robert Parks, Clive Owens' character, for much of the second half. But that is in fact not the murderer. Yeah, so they do a pretty good job of establishing Sir William as a terrible person. He is mean to most people, definitely to his wife. They don't like each other at all. He didn't serve in the First World War. He was instead an arms dealer. You can feel however you want about that, but the film certainly wants us to think that it's a bad thing to not fight in the war. He sexually harassed girls in the factory that his employees, and is continuing to do that in his current employ. Although Elsie, the head housemaid who he is sleeping with, does seem to like him.
Yeah, I think she says that at least he's intelligent and not stupid.
Mm-hmm.
He is the one that sort of creates this predatory family and the
Yeah.
predatory culture of his household. And he's not shy about
Mm-hmm.
the fact that he's in it for himself and he will run over people to
Mm-hmm.
whatever, with little thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we get sort of set up with like a bunch of different characters who have motives, but there's a pretty extended scene that we're probably supposed to pay particular attention to surrounding when the murder happens. So there's a altercation at dinner where Sir William and Lady Sylvia are arguing, and Elsie gives away the fact that she's sleeping with Sir William by speaking up to defend him and calling him Bill. So Lady Sylvia's mad at him. Elsie's probably not happy at the situation. And then everyone goes in. Sir William leaves to go to his study. Everyone else goes into the drawing room. And Ivor Novello is there playing some jaunty tunes to try to lighten the mood. And while he's playing the music, he goes through 4 or 5 songs. It's like 20 minutes.
Much to Maggie Smith's dismay.
Much to Maggie Smith's dismay. We see, some people leaving the drawing room. We see servants like peeking in at doors to listen to the famous Ivor Novello playing. And that's when the murder occurs. We pretty much get 4 people who could be the murderer. Robert Parks, who we see approaching to watch the music with Mary McEachran, and then sliding back out the door. Freddie Nesbitt, who is trying to get money out of Sir William, and it looks like he's going to be told no. Anthony Meredith, who has the same motive. And George the footman, who's played by Richard E. Grant, who he leaves the room claiming that he's run out of milk and needs to go refill it. And then later when he enters, Jennings, the butler, played by Alan Bates, says something along the lines of, "If that's what you call getting more milk, I'd hate to see what happens when you take a real break." I thought including George as a possible suspect was interesting because he is never set up with a motive. And I can't remember if Robert Parks, he is not set up with a motive, but he certainly seems like he's got some stuff going on that we don't know about.
Yeah, Clive Owen strikes the dark, brooding figure pretty well. He's established as having a mysterious past.
Yeah.
And he doesn't really want to talk about his past.
So George is maybe there to like throw heat off of, is maybe included as people with opportunity to throw heat off of Robert Parks, because the other two have a clearly established motive.
Yeah, and earlier in the day, there had been what could have been an attempted murder when they're actually at the hunting scene, because it is a hunting party. They're all there to go hunting, and they all go shooting together. And Julian Fellows has talked about how this film is directly inspired by an earlier French film, The Rules of the Game, by Jean Renoir, which is one of the great French films of all time. Also about an aristocratic family at a hunting party where, spoiler alert, someone gets murdered. So there's sort of an implication that it probably was somebody who was at the party, probably someone who was shooting, and presumptively then an aristocrat.
Yeah, the only people firing guns in the shooting scene are the aristocrats, and they have their servants reloading.
One of the things I really like about how Gosford Park handles the murder mystery, they sort of present a case where the crime doesn't quite fit any of the suspects. And it is quite a difficult puzzle because the evidence doesn't really seem to add up to one person committing the crime.
Yeah, I think it would have been very disappointing if, we established that Freddie and Anthony both want money from him, and then they slip out of the drawing room, and it turns out one of them did it.
Yeah.
That would be a terrible film.
So it is tricky to solve because there's kind of too much evidence for one person to have done all these things.
Yeah.
And the answer is one person didn't do all of these things. And so that is kind of an interesting puzzle to play with. But yeah, I mean, it's a murder mystery. It has strengths and weaknesses as a murder mystery and, as just a comedy and sort of a comedy of manners. I think the film's intention probably is really as a social commentary about the relationship between these wealthy nobles, arms dealers, people who are really disrespectful and sort of dehumanizing of their help. And then these servants who are sort of trapped in this capitalist prison, stuck in a life of oppression that they really have no vision of how to escape from.
Yeah, and you may be thinking like you don't have to work in domestic service, There were plenty of other jobs, especially by the 1930s.
That's a good job.
But yeah, the main career that domestic service is compared to is factory work. And it really seems like domestic service is better. I know one person says, my parents were both factory workers and they were better off.
I think we're meant to sort of take that tongue in cheek because standard of living, lifestyle, not the same. And I mean, it's the Great Depression. It's not a great economic time for people who just want to. It is the Great Depression
in the United Kingdom, which was slightly less terrible than in the United States. So yeah, I would say I really like what Gosford Park is doing with its story, but I don't always love how it's doing it with its story, because the primary flaw of the film is that there are two leaps of guesswork that two different characters make, which I really struggled to understand. And maybe if I watch it 9 more times, I'll figure out what they're thinking. But the first one that happens in the real story of what's going on, although we find out about it later, is that Helen Mirren's character, Mrs. Wilson, figures out that Robert Parks is her son. It makes sense how she's able to figure that out. But then she also figures out that he is there to murder Sir William, who is his father.
Yeah, she just sort of magically knows Clive Owen is here to do a murder. She has no evidence of this and can't explain it in any way. And
that's where the whole crux of the film comes from, because she decides to poison Sir William before her son can murder him, can stab him, so that he can never go to jail for murder. And it seems like she is sort of trying to be sneaky. She doesn't want to go to jail, but she's perfectly willing to go to jail if necessary. And fortunately, that made it too tricky for Inspector Thompson to figure out, and they both end up perfectly fine. The other big leap is Mary figuring this out. So she's talking to Elsie, who has been fired, and is on her way out. And Elsie says, Sir William always said something like, "Seize the day, carpe diem." And this causes a light bulb to go off in Mary's head to go, oh, Robert Parks is Sir William and Mrs. Wilson's son, and that means that if Sir William was murdered, that the poisoning was done by Mrs. Wilson, who figured it out. And I have no idea how she knew this.
Like, did Clive Owen say "seize the day" at some point in the movie? And even if he did, it's established that Clive Owen is an orphan and never really had contact with his father.
Right, so why would he pick up
so he wouldn't have heard him say "seize the day"?
Yeah.
So this just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Altman talked about when he was making the film, he wanted it to be a "it was done," not a "who done it." Mm-hmm. So I think that goes a lot to keep the focus on the characters and the story and the setting, but then it really does fall flat as a mystery. And the sort of last part of the movie, or the part before the end of the movie, is dissatisfying. Even though Helen Mirren is putting in a great performance, as she sort of revealed as the murderer, and I think this is going to be in contrast to Knives Out, which we'll talk about in a bit. It's quite satisfying for Mary, who is our audience surrogate, and has been extremely downtrodden, verbally abused by Lady Constance. It's nice for her to get a win, and for her to be smart, and for her to figure it out. I just wish I knew how she figured it out. Yeah, this is her moment to not just be the one pure character in the story, and that's a nice part of the story, but it's not really explained or justified. It's forced.
And I don't think it would have been that hard.
Sure.
Because, it seems like the premise of the film is that these rich people don't pay attention to their servants and where they are, and she just happens to be in too many places and hears too many things completely unnoticed. And one notable thing about the filmmaking, and it's included in the script, is that there is a servant present in every scene. Everything is being witnessed by one of the servants.
Yeah, Altman specifically mentioned that. And this is why I really believe him when he says that he kept having to be reminded that this is supposed to be a murder mystery, and he has to explain how the murder happened. Because he basically doesn't. He kind of skips it at the end.
And that, in fact, might tell us that neither Sir Anthony nor Freddie Nesbitt is the murderer, because we see the stabbing happen. We only see Clive Owen's shins and feet and his hand when he stabs Sir William. But if there has to be a servant present, it can't have been either of the other two. It had to be Robert Parks or George the footman.
That's a nice key. I like that. Is it ever even fully established if and who intentionally shot at him at the hunting party?
So there is a really brief exchange quite late in the film. It's like the day that people are packing up to leave. And Charles Dance in one of like the 6 lines that he has, says to Commander Meredith, I can't remember how he introduces the conversation, but he then says, "I saw you take the shot. It's not surprising that a man as short as you has difficulty aiming the gun." So
okay, yeah, I do vaguely remember.
Yeah,
yes.
and Meredith basically like stands there stunned and does not defend himself at all. So I think we are meant to understand that it was Meredith who took the shot that clipped Sir William in the ear. And to what extent this was an attempt at murder, on the one extreme, it could have been he was straight up trying to shoot him. On the other hand, maybe he is just too short to aim a gun properly. And then there's lots of gray space in between where he's like, if this hits Sir William, that's fine.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is not a forensic accounting podcast, but I never quite understood his motivation for the murder anyway. Like, he wants his continued operation on a business deal.
So Sir William is currently funding a business deal, which, like, is set up in writing and is about to renege on it. Or he has said that he is going to fund a project, but rumor is going around that he is now going to renege on it. So Meredith is trying to kill him before he can renege.
Yeah, but that's not really how estate management works. If he dies, at a minimum, he's going to need Christian Scott Thomas to support him, and likely even then, this is just not happening. I don't actually think the murder solves his financial problems.
I think Kristen Scott Thomas might support him because he's married to her sister. So Sir William doesn't care if Lavinia starves, but Sylvia would care if her sister Lavinia starves.
Yeah, I think you can kind of tell that Julian Fellows, when he wrote the script, did sort of plan out these different pieces, but it's not really brought to the forefront in the actual final product at all.
Yeah. Another theme that sort of gets mentioned but never really developed is the war. So they talk about how Sir William didn't serve. Lavinia has a line at one of the dinners saying, tragically, I don't care what happens in politics as long as our sons are spared what you all went through, which we know is not going to happen. And Jennings, the butler...
Yeah, at the end...
Something that absolutely should have been mentioned earlier is that the only person in the house with a criminal record is Jennings. And so the police assistant, Constable Dexter, says, you were sort of the first person we were looking at, but he was in the drawing room the whole time and definitely didn't have opportunity. And that gets introduced in maybe the third to last scene.
That scene... The performances
and the reason it's connected to the war is because he was a conscientious objector and served time in prison.
Yeah, the performances in that scene are quality performances, but that's maybe the worst scene in the whole movie. Because the constable just walks in and says, "Hey, just so you know, we thought that you were the murderer, but then because you had a criminal record, but then we checked and you only had a criminal record because you were a conscientious objector, so we don't think you're the murderer."
Yeah. And
you could have just not had this scene.
Or I would have loved for that information to be introduced way earlier.
I guess.
Just it to be one more example of there's too much evidence.
I think it'd be good if some sort of plan about how to present the evidence of the murder was actually integrated into the movie.
Yeah.
As opposed to just sort of peppered around at random times and then revealed illogically at the end.
Well, that maybe could have sent someone down the path, if we knew that Jennings had a criminal record, but the audience wasn't told what it was about yet. George, who does have opportunity, serves directly under and is talking to Jennings when they're pouring coffee in the drawing room during the murder. George has opportunity, but we don't hear anything about him having a motive. If we know that Jennings maybe has some sort of motive or is just naturally a criminal, big air quotes, that might send someone down the path of maybe they were working together.
Yeah, Inspector Thompson, played by Stephen Fry, his whole strategy is that it has to be someone who's really close to this person and has sort of been...
Or no, I think the theory he's working on for most of the case is that someone broke in to steal something, found Sir William there, panicked, and stabbed him. But then then he doesn't really deviate from this point of view when it is discovered that he was poisoned, that Sir William was poisoned first. It's maybe he poisoned him and then stabbed the corpse.
Yeah, he's constantly just sort of dismissing whole groups of people, not interested in the servants. He's also totally disinterested in the entertainment crew of Ivor Novello and Morris Weissman and
Henry
Denton, who are bringing a lot of like the entertainment value in the movie. Jeremy Northam, who played Ivor Novello, is doing live music in the movie and does quite a good job of it, and is really entertaining.
Well, that was his real singing, but the piano playing was actually done by his brother.
That's right.
So he's playing to a recorded piano, but I think that is his real singing in the... He's singing live on set. He's not lip syncing to a recording. And
Bob Balaban is as Morris Weissman, the American film producer. He's bringing a lot of the actual comedy of the movie. Yeah, Maggie Smith gets into it with Ivor Novello about his film career, and it is kind of nice that there is some like real life film entertainment history being mixed in. That you get to
the reason that Morris Weissman is there, so Ivor Novello is a cousin of Sir William, so he got invited as a member of the family. And he was able to bring Morris along because Morris is directing the new Charlie Chan picture, which is going to be set at an English country estate and is basically about what's happening in Gosford Park. Someone gets murdered, everyone's a suspect, and he's doing research.
I think Jeremy Northam as Ivor Novello is the best part of the movie, probably. I mean, it's not really related to the rest of the plot very much, but it's a really layered and fully brought out performance of a real historical figure who also made, scary murder mysteries like The Lodger. So it's interesting to see how much the film wants to be based in history, including in bringing in real life historical figures to sort of show this type of thing, these types of stories. We're not making this up. These are things that real people were actually talking about in their time as well.
Yeah, but they do take several opportunities to point out that Morris Weissman, this American, doesn't really know how it's supposed to work. He's constantly on the phone saying things like, in the script they keep having this Cockney maid run in and say things, but the servants here, they don't say things.
Yeah. One of the really clever things about Gosford Park that I think made it succeed not just critically but also commercially and for a lot of a really broad audience to be able to enjoy it is that they expect you to be confused. And there's multiple different characters who don't know what's going on and need things explained to them in some really naturalistic and actually interesting ways. Kelly MacDonald, she's arriving there as a new servant, has to be told about how this house works and what makes the people in this house special. And then Ryan Philippe is there, so also in theory as another new servant arriving at this house, but eventually we learn that he is actually not a servant at all. He's an American actor bringing an unconvincing Scottish accent, trying to pretend to be a servant so he can research for his next film role. And it actually is very interesting where at the beginning he tries to hide this from the other servants and they're very suspicious for him. And at several points, Kelly MacDonald kind of comes in and as a real new servant has to ask a question that gives Ryan Philippe the information that he can use to sort of evade detection. So they know that you maybe you're an American, maybe you don't know about fancy British stuff, maybe you don't really follow all the story exactly and you need some introduction to the characters. And so there's always a character that represents you as the viewer and needs to be educated. Yeah. And they actually end up interacting with each other and creating a story about different people who hiding things and learning things from each other.
And I think Sir William is actually also one of those people. At some point, he says, "Who's sitting next to me at dinner?" to his wife. And she says, "My Aunt Constance." And he's like, "I don't want a Constance. I want Lavinia." Or I want, what does he want? I want Louisa, who he's definitely flirting with and possibly sleeping with. And she says, "Do I have to remind you of the table of precedence again? Talk about how everyone condescends to you, and then you behave like a peasant." This film has maybe it doesn't have the best one-liners, but it has such a huge collection of excellent one-liners that you can watch it just for that and have a perfectly good time.
Yeah, if you like saucy BBC costume dramas, this is the crystallization of those concepts. I don't think the movie has a great ending. The mystery gets resolved in a fundamentally unsatisfying way, and then our characters kind of get sent off like everything is fine now.
Yeah.
Even though everything is not fine now.
I think it's, to some extent, that's perfectly reasonable, because the real problem of this film is not that someone gets murdered. It's that so many people are stuck in these terrible jobs. And that's not something that this film is going to solve. We can't solve capitalism in this 2-hour murder mystery.
It certainly doesn't try to.
So, I mean, I think if everyone was suddenly happy, that would feel bad.
Well, I think exactly what you're talking about is what happens with Kelly MacDonald. Where at the end of the movie, we're really given this impression that her spirit is lightened and she has now this positive outlook.
Yeah.
And it's really in contrast, even though nothing has really changed in her life. She's still a servant to a really mean lady and has no chance.
I think she has become less scared of Lady Constance. What the film is trying to show us is, in the very first scene, she and Lady Constance are in the car, and she's basically afraid to talk to her. In the last scene, they get back in the car, and she is way more confident speaking to her. So she's figured something out. I think she's maybe realized, I'm not dumb. I can figure out what people want. Or I think she maybe was sort of in awe of Lady Constance to begin with, and now she's like, oh, she's just a dumb, mean old lady. And if she doesn't like me, that's fine. I'm not going to be invested in that, and that makes it a lot easier to talk to her.
Yeah, she has matured a lot through the process, but her victory is now she gets to be a good servant. It's really in contrast to Elsie's character. I think she's the person who ends up with an actual satisfying and interesting ending, even if it is only established in the final shots of the movie where sort of Bob Weissman drives by. That's Morris Weissman drives by and says, "Hey, want to ride to the airport?" Basically saying
to London.
Want to star in my next movie is kind of what we're implied to take from that, and she gets to go off and live her own life for real.
So if there's probably 30 servants depicted in this film, if at every hunting party, one of the 30 servants gets their lucky break and gets to go and be a movie star, I think we can solve this.
That is basically the thesis of the film, which is in some ways a noble sentiment, although not.
No, our cat does not think that's a noble sentiment.
Yeah,
she does not want to get on an airplane.
That's a good point.
So I'm feeling good on Gosford Park. You ready to do Knives Out?
Let's do it.
Okay, so Knives Out is a 2019 film. That's unusually recent for us. Written and directed by Ryan Johnson. Again, big cast, not quite as big as Gosford Park, but I'm going to introduce it to you as sort of by generation. So Harlan Thrombey is played by Christopher Plummer. He has 3 children. Linda Drysdale, played by Jamie Lee Curtis. She is married to Richard, played by Don Johnson. They have a son named Hugh, who generally goes by Ransom Drysdale, played by Chris Evans. His second child is confusingly dead, and we are actually interacting with his daughter-in-law, Joni Thrombey, played by Toni Collette. And his youngest son is Walt, played by Michael Shannon. The servants in the Thrombey house, I hesitate to use that term, but that's certainly, I think, how the film wants us to think of them, are Fran, played by Edie Patterson, she's the housekeeper, and Marta Cabrera, played by Ana de Armas, who is the nurse for Harlan. And then we have Benoit Blanc, played by Daniel Craig, with a enigmatic accent. He's supposed to be from Louisiana, and I can only imagine that this is meant to be a Hercule Poirot reference, because, as we all know, Louisiana is the Belgium of the United States.
We all agree.
Yeah. And, I think Daniel maybe needed another week or two with the Louisiana accent.
Well, as a matter of fact, Daniel Craig was hired at the last second to participate in this film. And
they refused to change the location that Benoit was from?
I think they just thought it'd be cute.
It has nothing to do with the story that he's from Louisiana.
Nope. But, I think he's sort of supposed to be some sort of Southern gentleman. That's how he's introduced.
Who could hate a Southern gentleman?
So yeah, production-wise, Ryan Johnson worked on this film for a long time, over a decade. He started on the concept of it in 2005, and he wanted to revitalize the murder mystery genre. But photography didn't actually get started until October of 2018. So over 13 years trying to get it made. Everyone in the film was more or less hired at the last second, sort of who is available.
And I think that that's actually an astounding, like, there isn't an Oscar for casting director, but this person should have won it. Because I was stunned when you told me how quickly people were hired.
Mm-hmm.
Because given that almost all of the cast is related, they really look like a family. I absolutely believe that Jamie Lee Curtis is the daughter of Christopher Plummer. And I would absolutely believe that Chris Evans is the son of Jamie Lee Curtis and Don Johnson. I think they did a great job of making people look related.
Well, there absolutely should be an Oscar for Best Casting Director, and I totally agree with you. This would win it. The casting is very good, but once you look into how the film was made and how they were sort of forced to just sort of take who was available and make it work, it was brilliantly done.
Mm-hmm.
So the film was released not much longer, about a year later, in September of 2019. The film had a $40 million budget. Its opening weekend, it made $30 million. It went on to make $165 million in the United States and over $300 million around the world.
And was it released in theaters or was it released on Netflix?
It was released in theaters.
Okay.
So, yeah, this movie, when it came out, was kind of credited as, like, saving the film industry.
Mm-hmm.
Audience numbers had been down for a long time, and this sort of was an event movie that people wanted to see. It was a Top Gun or a Barbieheimer event before that was as ingrained. It was a cultural phenomenon and sort of was one of the films that make people wanted to start going back to the theaters. And it made a lot of money. It made $270 million in profit, almost an 800% return. Mm-hmm. So very successful. The critical reception was good. It was an AFI Top 10 Movie of the Year. It got good reviews. The only Oscar nomination was for screenplay, which it didn't win. Honestly, I think, again, I feel like what made the film stand out is its direction and its cinematography and its visual storytelling. Its stylishness, I think, is a perfect term. Not so much the screenplay. A good screenplay, I guess, has
it's a normal
strengths and weaknesses. But like Gosford Park, I'm very surprised that it was nominated for screenplay and not direction. But again, at the BAFTAs, same thing. Nominated only for screenplay, didn't win. Which maybe is undercutting the film a little bit overall, but to celebrate the screenplay, to me, is misdirected.
Yeah.
Of course, Rian Johnson is a really successful director. He made The Last Jedi and the Star Wars movies. Mm-hmm. Also, he worked a lot with Joseph Gordon-Levitt. You may have seen Brick or Looper, both of which were pretty successful kind of mystery-type films. He initially came to fame as the director of several really well-acclaimed episodes of Breaking Bad, including Ozymandias, the second to last or third to last episode. So yeah, that's the movie. It was a success, more of a commercial success than a critical success, but some of both, and really a huge commercial success for the time.
And then what's the deal with the Netflix situation? Did it just also end up on Netflix? I know that its sequel is a Netflix exclusive.
That's right. The sequel, Knives Out, Glass Onion, a Knives Out Mystery.
Bad title.
It is a Netflix exclusive, and yeah, there's controversy around that, and because the film was originally celebrated for making people not watch movies on Netflix, and Netflix bid really hard for the original Knives Out film, and the studios won the bid, and they were like, great, now we have a studio franchise. And then they just went back to Netflix. Partially, that was when the pandemic was really at its height. Yeah. And so it was, to some extent, a necessity. Yeah, in the film, there are a couple kind of Netflix digs where they sort of talk about how, everything gets made on Netflix now, and kind of implying that that's the factory, maybe not as high quality path out. But, I guess history can interpret that one way or the other. So yeah, just maybe to introduce the plot at a high level before we get too deep into the ultra spoilers. Yeah. So, in modern-day New England, after the upper-class family of a super-rich murder mystery author gather for his 85th birthday party, the author is found dead. The family doesn't really like each other. They keep a lot of secrets, and they have a weird racist relationships with the author's hired immigrant nurse. When a gentleman private investigator discovers that the nurse involuntarily vomits whenever she lies, he decides that he's found a way to crack the case open. Yeah. That's the plot of the movie.
That is the plot of the movie.
So at the start of the movie, we have a little bit of atmosphere shots, but then we jump into, I really like the term you used, the super stylized introduction of all the sort of different major players and family members, with title cards introducing their names. And
yeah, we see them being interviewed by Benoit, this private investigator. So, we get a shot just of them. All of them are in the same location. So each time we get introduced to a new character, they have the same background. And then next to their head, as though they were in a YouTube video, their name, and I think also their relationship to Harlan pops up, and we hear their immediate reactions to, or not their immediate reaction, because this is about a week after the death. We hear their response to police interrogation.
Yeah, and I think it's the way this movie starts that makes it work. Its intention is to sort of give a thoughtful murder mystery story that's presented for, the information now generation. And unlike a lot of murder mysteries, unlike Gosford Park, where we sort of get introduced to the characters and the environment, and then eventually the murder happens.
Yeah, the murder happens at
and
almost
eventually
exactly
we
the
start
halfway
investigating
point.
it. Exactly, in Gosford Park. In this movie, the murder happens at the beginning. We are getting introduced to all the other characters, YouTube style, and we are told about Marta's medical condition, in the first 10 minutes of the movie.
Yeah.
And it's like, great. Now we don't really need to spend a lot of time deducing all the evidence. We can just go around and do the action of the story. Yeah. And I think that's where it largely succeeds. It is a murder mystery, but it's not really about discovering all the secrets. It's about the action of the story.
Yeah. So one key thing to know about this, if you haven't seen it, is that this is non-linear. Much of the action takes place a week after, about over the course of 3 days, a week after Harlan's death. And then we have several flashbacks to the night of the death.
The murder mystery genre is often defined by this scene where the investigator walks in and explains the story and sort of narrates all the evidence to reveal what happens. In Gosford Park, we're largely parodying that genre. So as soon as Inspector Thompson tries to begin his explanation, everyone just interrupts him and stops listening.
Yes.
In this movie, the whole movie is basically hanging out with this inspector guy as he narrates different evidence, and he always seems to sort of know what's really going on and is drip feeding it to us as the script progresses.
Yeah, and I think that's very much in our cat is murdering the carpet. Sorry if you can hear that. And I think that's very much in the classic murder mystery style, specifically an Agatha Christie style.
Yeah, in the original version of this story, Benoit Blanc was an explicit Hercule Poirot parody, and he had all the same mannerisms and a more similar accent. So he sort of evolved from a intentional Poirot reference.
Did that change because of Ken Branagh's Poirot films? Which I think Murder on the Orient Express would have come out before filming, but after Rian Johnson's conception of this film.
My understanding is that this was a gradual change because the studio was like, not enough people know who this is. This is too in of a bit to focus on.
Yeah, so Benoit Blanc is mostly filling the Hercule Poirot role, but I think he is sometimes getting some Sherlock references, just in like the being sort of weird and off-putting. So, like, in this first scene where we're being introduced to all the characters, he's not interrogating them. Two local police officers are interrogating them. And he is sitting about 20 feet back in the room next to a piano. And whenever they say something he doesn't like, whenever they say something he thinks is wrong, it's not totally clear because this is the first scene. He plays a very high note on the piano. It's seemingly to sort of be irritating.
Yeah, this opening sequence where he's playing the piano has been heavily analyzed, and there are different theories about what is that even supposed to mean. One of the theories is that he wants them to ask a particular question, which I think is like, where were you when you heard Harlan was dead, or whenever that was announced or whatever. So he's sort of saying, okay, this is the time, and it's kind of implying he believes that they've set themselves up in a way where to answer that question honestly, they have to lie, and this is where he can catch them in the lie. So
it's a cue to his colleagues.
In each case, the suspect or the person being interviewed is sort of trying to lead the investigators off and distract them by, with some red herring. And so he's saying, okay, focus up and ask the question now. That's the theory, but it's not really that well explained. It's a little mushy. Yeah.
And it's also impossible to know at the first time you're watching the film.
Yeah, the point is like you're saying, he's some sort of Sherlock Holmes guy who's got his own clever if slightly off-kilter way of solving mysteries. Mm-hmm. That's what you're really learning in those moments.
Okay, so I want to get right into the character of Harlan, our murder victim, air quotes, because I think this is a pretty unsuccessful part of the film. I think that the movie clearly wants us to like Harlan and think he's a good guy. But there's just too many things that if Harlan is a good guy, then these things are plot holes.
Yeah, so Harlan is the patriarch of the family.
Yes.
He's a murder mystery author who's written a ton of really successful murder mysteries.
Yeah. Appears to have made money that the whole family is living off of.
He's certainly played as one of our most sympathetic characters, who's sort of trying to save Marta from the oppression of the rest of the family. But what he's really doing is toying with her.
Yeah.
He finds her an interesting person to play games against and with, and when he's in the critical moments of the story, when he's supposed to be helping her, in a way what he's really doing is setting up a really cool murder mystery story. Yeah. And it's not clear if that was his best idea, or if maybe what he really just loves is making great murder mysteries, and he just looks for opportunities to do that in kind of an almost inhuman way.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting character to write, and it's totally fine to write a character like that. Where it's a problem for the film is that Marta, our protagonist, who we actually haven't really talked about yet, Marta really likes him and cares about him, and she's really distressed that he's murdered, and that she thinks she has killed him by accidentally giving him an overdose. I find it, one, unrealistic that she would actually like Harlan as much as she is portrayed to. And then if she does, I don't like her very much. And one of the big things about this film is how unlikable most of the cast is. So if we're also going to not like Marta, then this is just a miserable film full of miserable people. So here's my problems with Harlan. One, he has secretly left everything to Marta. So the house, $60 million in his will. Yeah, in his will. His house, his cash and investments, and his publishing company. So including all future proceeds from his books. And he has told no one about this. It's in a sealed will, which is opened in maybe 20 minutes into the film, much to the distress of his family. I could maybe believe that a normal person would make the mistake of doing this, which puts Marta in a position where it really seems like she killed him, where she's benefiting and she was his primary medical care provider. So now, obviously, Harlan didn't know how he was going to die when he wrote this will, but he is a murder mystery writer. Of all people, he should know that this is going to make Marta look suspicious. And it doesn't make sense why he wouldn't at least, tell his lawyer beforehand. At this point, it could look like Marta switched the wills. Marta bullied him into doing this, or he wasn't of sound mind when he wrote this will. Another thing is that the film does a pretty good job of establishing all of Harlan's family members as pretty awful, except for his granddaughter, Meg, who is a college student, so she's not quite a minor, but she's pretty young. She's the only person who seems to actually care about Marta. We see her get bullied by her family into calling Marta and pretending that she's genuinely asking her to give the money back, even when she doesn't really want to make this phone call. And his granddaughter is also getting screwed by him not leaving her anything. And I think the way I would have solved this is to make the granddaughter less likable. Mm-hmm. He has a grandson who pretty much the only thing we know about him is that he's involved with white supremacist internet things.
Yeah.
So we're okay.
Which is really left in as a joke a little bit too casually.
Yeah.
Quite too casually.
Yeah. But so we either needed to make Meg worse, or we needed him to set $50,000 aside for Meg, or at least finish paying her tuition at Smith, because Smith is a very expensive school. And the third thing, which it took me a while to figure out, is that we see Marta's house. Marta lives in a kind of crummy apartment that she shares with her mother and sister. And Harlan lives in this incredibly elaborate mansion. And Harlan is also Marta's only client. He has hired her privately. She isn't working through a firm. So he knows that
Yeah, the movie really goes out of the way to establish that she is the private nurse and doesn't work for a firm.
Yeah.
Like, that's a key plot point. Not part of the mystery.
It's not.
But they want us to know.
So my question is, why isn't Harlan paying Marta $300,000 a year? If he wants her to have this money, and so that his family can't have this money, why doesn't he start giving it to her? He doesn't know how long he's going to live. He could live another 10 years. And then she's just going to be living, not quite in poverty, but not living in a great situation.
Yeah, like, the whole situation seems to be a joke to him.
Mm-hmm. I mean, sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. Like, when he thinks Marta has accidentally given him an overdose and she's killed him, he seems really concerned about, if she gets investigated, they're going to find out about her mother, and her mother's going to be deported.
He knows the stakes.
Yeah, like, it does seem like he really wants to help, and he thinks he's helping. But he's definitely wrong, and would know that he's wrong, given that writing murder mysteries is his job.
Yeah, he's really excited about setting up clever bits and interesting things to discover, which I guess does, in theory, make for an interesting movie because there's so many clever bits being set up, but then he's also sort of brought forward as the hero and, in a way, the sort of driving good guy of the story. Mm-hmm. And I think it's not, to me, it connects back to a bigger issue with the whole movie where Marta is our protagonist. Mm-hmm. She's the character we're supposed to identify with and care about, and she's the one that we follow throughout the story. But she actually has very little agency in this story.
Yeah.
And basically, for the whole movie, there are old, wealthy white men who go around being smart and figuring everything out and doing the important things. And her job is to sort of benefit from them as long as she stays in their good graces. And that's actually very much the way the film is set up. And it wants to be a movie about serious issues about class and race. And it does talk about how discrimination exists and it's a problem. But the solution it proposes is that we should find some nice people of these downtrodden situations, and as long as they sort of follow our instructions, we'll give them something nice about it at the end. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really actually want to talk at all about the systemic issues.
Yeah, Benoit, in his sort of summing up, and so what the audience is supposed to take away about Marta is that she's a good nurse, mm-hmm. and she cares about her patients. Mm-hmm. I'm like, great, okay, so our woman of color gets to be a loving, caring person. She does not get to be smart. She does not get to be brave. She does not get to be witty. And
except maybe at the very end a little bit. And not even then it's in an unsatisfying way.
And it's overshadowed by what Benoit is doing in that scene.
Yeah, he's the hero. He's the cool guy.
Yeah. And so I thought this movie was really interesting to watch in comparison with Gosford Park, where quite satisfyingly, I mean, the way it happens isn't satisfying, but the fact that it happens is very satisfying, is that our downtrodden maid solves the mystery.
Right.
And I wanted Marta to solve the mystery.
Yeah.
I think I would have liked this movie if they had written Blanc out.
Yeah, at the end of the story, when Marta is exonerated, more or less, and she's left with her wealthy house. Now, I remember when I first watched it several years ago, as soon as I was done, I came to you and I said, well, it was a good movie, but they really should have just taken this Daniel Craig character out of the story. Mm-hmm. Because he is the one that ends up being the hero when it's supposed to be a story about the heroism of this person who is an immigrant and discriminated against. And also, I really wish at the end of the movie, Marta had burned down the mansion. Mm-hmm. Because at the end, now she is this new patriarch. She is the one that's in control and sort of behind the system of everything. And they did end up making another movie, but I think they basically had to transplant the story to a totally new set of characters, mm-hmm. which is basically unconnected to the original, because if they made a direct sequel, Marta would be the villain of the sequel. She is now the person who is behind everything, and it's actually supposed to be inspiring, but I think it's actually kind of a dark story at the end.
Yeah, I mean, it's better for nice, caring people to be millionaires than for mean assholes to be millionaires, but it's not good.
Yeah. It makes me think about how if you want to make a movie, you have to sell it to a bunch of rich old white dudes.
Yeah.
And it really feels like a movie that is appealing has a social message and is willing to talk about social messages, but is very careful to make sure that rich old white dudes with a lot of power and experience still get to be the real heroes, the real actors, and the real driving forces behind what's going on. people say that the racists are rich white dudes, but it's actually their kids who aren't appreciative enough of all the work that they had to put in for them.
Exactly.
And if their kids would just go off and pick themselves up by their bootstraps, then maybe they'll give them some money at the end. It's like, yeah, this is not as progressive of a story as it's sort of presented initially. You know, it's made me think about when this was Christopher Plummer's last film, basically before he died.
Didn't he step in to replace Spencer Tracy? Not
Spencer Tracy. Whoa.
Maybe that also
I know
happened.
what you're talking about. I want to hear your version of that story.
I did switch Kevin Spacey with Spencer Tracy right there. I'm
that
sorry.
Was before.
Spencer. Okay, that was before.
That's what sort of brought him back into the forefront of Hollywood.
Retired.
He would definitely want to tell you he was still working. That reports of his retirement were, but he was not as in public eye. Yes.
So his last film was about him dying.
Yes. But yeah, when he was interviewed about the film afterwards, they said, "Oh, so it's a murder mystery, but it's also a commentary on class. So there's a serious element to it." And he said, They asked him, "Would you agree with that?" And he said, "Yeah, I do. But mercifully, it isn't preachy. It's treated beautifully and with a light touch, so it doesn't emerge as a lecture." And I think the film really does want to make that point. It does have things to say about class, and maybe where it succeeds is a sort of a neo-realist project to sort of document what's going on in society and portray it honestly. And I think it basically succeeds at doing that. But it's actually really careful to say, we don't actually want to offend conservatives and make them not want to enjoy the story. So we'll just sort of play off white supremacy as a joke. And we don't want to, actually say that there are any systemic problems. There should just be the rich white guy in charge should just be nicer. If he was just nicer and maybe a little bit, more fair to people of different colors, then I think everything would be fine. Yeah,
and I think we really see this with Harlan's two grandkids. So his grandson, whose name I can't remember, he has maybe 3 lines, is a white supremacist as a joke within the script. He appears to be a real white supremacist, but also he's 19, so what does that mean? And his granddaughter, all of her family members are talking about how she's like this liberal hippie getting her degree in pronouns from Smith or whatever.
Right.
She doesn't really seem to be as cartoonish as the grandson in the scenes where we get to interact with her. So I don't really know how we're supposed to
her
feel
politics
about her.
Aren't part of the film at all.
Yeah. Maybe she is really as liberal as her family says she is, or maybe she's just getting a degree in English.
I think the film's intention is to say that, is intention to attack, to some extent, traditional liberal establishment and sort of point out their empty support. It's really eager to talk about how young progressives are not actually as consistent with their ideals as they think they are. And then everyone else, it doesn't really want to talk very much about their problems, and it's just kind of a joke.
Yeah, so both of his grandchildren are presented kind of unclearly as extremists. And it seems like the film maybe wants you to think about each of them the same way. Like, they're both sort of equally... If you're a conservative watching this, you can be like, oh yes, this granddaughter getting her degree in pronouns is very silly. And if you are a progressive watching this, you can go, oh, this horrible grandson on his white supremacist forums. And you can just sort of read whatever... If you can read anything from a text, then we probably don't need the text.
It might not have that much to say.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it succeeds as an entertaining movie. I think it succeeds as a neo-realist document of...
Oh, I did want to say something about this. So you talk about how it's sort of portraying things how they really are. There is one element of utter fantasy in this film that we haven't addressed, which I think is even worse than the 2 leaps of genius that we see in Gosford Park. And that is that Marta vomits whenever she lies. So that's not real. That's not a thing. Some people will vomit from anxiety, and lying can make people very anxious. But it is pretty much magical in this film, the way it works. So Marta, if she literally says a lie, this causes her to basically do sort of one big gush. But if she talks around the truth, or like if she is able to say something that is technically true while concealing the information that might get her into trouble, she doesn't throw up. And I think people who actually do vomit from anxiety about lying, it's not is the literal sentence you said a lie. It's how stressful is this situation. this is introduced at the beginning, and she does, a big obvious vom. But it seems like there are other times where the script does need Marta to lie in front of Benoit, and then they're able to make it so that it's not a problem. So one time, in this initial interview she's doing with Benoit, she throws up maybe 2 times and he figures out what's going on. But then the 3rd time she lies, she's able to get to the bathroom before she throws up. Another time, she and Ransom, Chris Evans' character, have run away from the police very stupidly. And it's because she doesn't want to get caught by the police. But when Benoit is with the police at that time, and when he says, "Did Ransom tell you to floor it?" Because they're more looking into Ransom at that point than her. She says, "Yes," which is a lie.
Well, he did technically say floor it.
Well, she then throws up.
Right.
So she gets in the car, has like a big gulp soda or something in there with her, manages to spit some vomit into the cup. And I would like to say, when you throw up, that is like a huge contraction of your abdominals, like your whole torso moves. And that doesn't happen with her. Yeah. So she gets one quick vom really fast, while Benoit is walking around the car to get in the passenger seat. She then drives him somewhere. And I don't know if you know this, but vomit has a very strong smell. Yeah. And I think a police...
I was so sure that was going to be part of the story.
A private investigator would be able to smell that over like the 5 to 30 minutes that he's in a car sitting right next to a cup full of vomit. So, like, whenever it's inconvenient, we just wave it away. Yeah. And boy, did we need to cut that part.
Well, it's natural to talk around this part because it's gross. Yeah. And, I think it's supposed to be there for kind of shock comedy, and I guess it's slightly effective in that way. So, it hits that market too. But it is handled really clumsily. And at the beginning of the film, I disagree that it needed to be cut because I don't think this movie works without that element. And that's why I included it in the summary, because this is the thing that in the first 20 minutes of the film reassures the audience that they're not going to have to sit through a proper murder mystery thing. Okay. Because Benoit Blanc basically has a magic button he can use to test if anything is true or false. Mm-hmm. So this is what makes it more of an action movie than an actual murder movie. Except the button
doesn't actually work because she can hide the vomit or say something that's not literally false.
But then when they want to add more layers to the mystery, to just make things complicated, they sort of realize, oh, wait, we have a way to solve all of this, and then they have to force that out of the movie. Mm-hmm. So, it is gross, and I don't know if I really want it in the movie, but I really understand why it was there. And I think the real problem is the third quarter of the movie is just bad. Mm-hmm. It's not good. Basically from when she leaves the house, or maybe when she leaves the diner with Ransom, until they get back into the house, the movie really loses steam. There's a really weird car chase that the movie calls out and says, "This was the dumbest car chase of all time," is a line in the movie.
And as you're listening to this, remember that Rian Johnson had 13 years to develop this script. It feels like what happened was he had a script and the studio said, "More action. Mm-hmm. You need a car chase." Mm-hmm. And he was like, "Fuck, I have to get a car chase in here somehow."
I mean, as an action scene, it's not that badly shot. It's not even like, oh, it was a really stupid car chase. And, kind of the joke is that her car isn't very fast, so it's more of a slow chase.
Yeah, she's maxing out at 60.
But that works, it's actually fine. But it just doesn't really fit into the story at all, because she just led the police on a giant car chase, and then the police are like, well, that was a silly thing to do. Now let's continue cooperating for the rest of the investigation.
Yeah, it's stupid for her to do. Guys, never run from the police. Yeah. You will not be successful. Yeah. And now you just have another crime. But then she also faces no consequences for it.
And then, to me, the worst part of the movie is this extra bit with Fran, where we add another layer of mystery.
Which is the most horrific. Mm-hmm. It's shot and scored like a horror movie. There's a lot of
spider.
dark shadows, spider on a dead woman's face. She's not quite dead, but, Yeah. Yeah, so I'm wondering if the studio also said, more drama.
I guess so. I mean, up until that point, everything's been really carefully structured. We're always like in an intimate space, in a diner, in someone's home, in their car, with characters we know, all the same characters just interacting in the same way across each other. And then we have this really shoved in part in a totally different setting with a totally different tone and with this terrible mystery building where we get a clue, and the clue is that we hear Fran say one thing, but actually she was supposed to be saying another thing. Yeah. And if you turn on the subtitles, it says that she said the wrong thing the first time.
Oh.
So we are just misled, and there's no way for us to figure out.
Not an accessible mystery, Mr. Johnson.
Well, it is accessible because you have to know that at the beginning you're supposed to hear one thing when actually a different thing happened. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but the point being...
If the mystery doesn't work if you turn subtitles on, it's not accessible.
No, the mystery does work because... Well, whatever. Yeah.
Only if you lie in the subtitles.
Yeah, exactly.
So she says, Hugh did this, and we hear you did this, Hugh being Ransom's first name.
So I might be off about the subtitles, but the point being, it's just a lazy and dumb clue. We're like, here's how I'll trick you. I'll make you think I said a thing when I actually said a different thing. I'm sure other mysteries do it, but it's, for me, just really unsatisfying.
Other mysteries doing it doesn't mean it's good.
I feel like the film does come together, and the final sort of confrontation action scene, we have a little bit more of this, does she have to throw up or not? But at least now that's the center part of the film. And this is supposed to be Marta's moment where she is brave and clever because she finally learns to lie, which is a somewhat empowering message about how you have to play dirty when it comes to disenfranchisement, but also just kind of a weird message where it's like, yeah, and the moral of the story is Marta should start lying just like everyone else did. That's the right way out. I think it's really well directed. I think the cinematography at the closing is back to the real strength of the movie. But again, that this is nominated for screenplay when I feel like as a screenplay it has a ton of issues, and it's just a really well directed movie. All things considered, a really well acted movie. I really like Daniel Craig. His performance is very silly, but that's, I guess, the point. And, it does, I think, work as an entertainment product. But as a screenplay, as a murder mystery, and as class commentary, I don't know that it was quite received appropriately. Speaking personally, I feel like these are both movies that I like. I think they're entertaining. I think they're interesting. I think they have really substantive filmmaking, and they do have something interesting to say artistically. I think in both cases, there's actually a really big compromise being played here. Yeah. And we could blame the creatives maybe, but maybe blame the system of film production here for necessitating not only sometimes like artistic compromises, but ideological compromises. And so both films are really presented as these cutting and insightful stories about the class and violence in society, but actually they're pretty lukewarm. And I feel like they're more stories about how it would be nice if the chairs were shuffled around a little bit instead of actually talking about any real systemic issues.
Yeah, you phrased it very well, and I would love to take credit for this, but I'm saying it to your face, so I have to give you credit. You said both of these films talk about how wealth inequality enables abuse. But they are really bad at talking about how wealth inequality is abuse.
Exactly. And, to some extent this is a problem in Gosford Park, but this is really what leaves me feeling unsatisfied with Knives Out. That the way the story is resolved, the great story is, now there's a different billionaire. Now this nice immigrant lady is a billionaire. Well,
and the final shot is her up in the balcony of the house looking down at the family in the driveway as they sort of like back away and have to leave.
Yeah. So it does want to talk about how there are abusive relationships, just like you said, that have to do with class and society. But it doesn't want to talk about how the real problem is that there's this horrible system of class that is dividing people, and some people get to live real lives and other people don't. And it actually goes out of its way to defend that and to say that it's not a problem. And, if you're going to make a story about class, then you need to talk about the real issues.
Yeah. So another thing that connects these two is that they were both, the golden age of the murder mystery is very much over. But these were both sort of trying to revitalize the murder mystery film genre.
You're so right. Both films really came with the intentional goal of people don't like murder mysteries anymore. I think we can make them popular again. We'll put some new elements in there.
We'll put a new spin on them. Neorealism in different ways.
It's weird to make a neorealist movie about 100 years ago, but that's what it is. Classic Julian Fellows.
It was only 70 years ago.
Good point.
His parents were alive. This is normal times. And one thing that I like about the way Gosford Park does it, and because I've seen Gosford Park, it made me dislike the way they do it in Knives Out is that I'm not an expert on true crime, either the genre of modern media or actual true crimes, but from what I can tell, the vast majority of murders, it's either extremely obvious who the murderer is, or it never gets solved. This sort of classic, like Sherlock Holmes, Agatha Christie murder mystery, where you just need one really smart person who spends many hours looking at all the clues, talking to all the people, going to the scene of the crime, finding all the evidence, and putting it all together. That happens very rarely.
I'm more than happy to confirm that it has nothing to do with real police work.
Yeah. So one thing that I like about Gosford Park is that the murder mystery is not solved by the police. And it doesn't make sense for the murder mystery to be solved.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this was a really complicated situation. There's a bunch of people in the house. There's a bunch of people that it could have been. And it also could have been some other random person breaking in. It doesn't make sense that the police would be able to solve this. And they don't. And the people who do solve it are the people who have intimate knowledge of the situation.
That's right.
In Knives Out, this is another reason that I wanted Marta to solve it.
Yes.
Because she is intimately involved. She knows Ransom, who we haven't actually said it, but is the actual murderer. Or actually, there is no murderer. He switched the medicine, and she thought she had switched them.
Marta is the murderer.
Well, it's a suicide. Marta was saying, let me call the police.
Oh,
and Harlan was saying, we're not going to call the police. I'm going to kill myself.
You're right.
So it's a suicide, not a murder. That's why at the beginning I was referring to it as Harlan's death, not his murder.
It's a tricky one.
And one thing that I liked about what was going on in Knives Out is when we get these flashbacks to what Marta was doing to try to follow Harlan's instructions. So Harlan thinks he's going to die from this drug overdose, so he's going to slit his throat first, and he's got 10 minutes to explain to Marta what she needs to do. She needs to, drive her car past where the security cameras are. He tells her where that is, and then park the car, walk back, climb in, blah, 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 dress in his clothes, etc., etc. And Marta tries really hard to do this, but she fails. Like, she forgets how far the security cameras go, and she pulls off too early so that her pulling off in the car is seen. She gets seen by Harlan's, 105-year-old mother, climbing up to the attic where he had killed himself.
Is that you, Ransom?
Is that you, Ransom? She, when she was walking back to the house, walks into mud, and her shoe prints are visible a week later.
Yeah.
We'll go with it. When Benoit Blanc is investigating, and so she has to, walk ahead of him and
Trash all over.
and put her footprints there again and ruin the footprints. And I really like that because it's showing how, it's actually really hard to conceal that you have done a murder.
Yeah.
But if you do successfully conceal it, it's very hard for the police to figure it out. And then later, when we find out that Ransom was the one who had actually, the real crime is Ransom, leaving and then swapping the drugs. He does it perfectly. He doesn't walk through the mud. He knows where to park his car. He doesn't walk through the mud. He walks along the little stone fence. Of course, the problem is that the dogs don't like him because he's not a caring person.
That's right.
Marta is a caring person, so the dogs don't bark at her because that's Marta's one attribute. And so I was like, oh, you just ruined this thing that I'd really liked about it. So I kind of hope that maybe this would be the story of someone who didn't actually do a crime, but could certainly be accused of a crime, trying to cover it up, and how hard that is.
And on the other side of the same issue, it turns out at the end that Benoit Blanc, because of one spot of blood on Marta's shoes, knew everything from the beginning and had already figured it all out. So from every angle, it's a story about rich old white guys, or at least rich white guys, who are actually really good at everything and know what's going on, and then a nice immigrant lady who's sort of their toy and mascot. Yeah,
Harlan and Benoit are just sort of playing this fun game that they've been forced into by Ransom, and Marta is a pawn.
Yeah. If these movies or these sort of issues that we're talking about here are interesting to you, I do really recommend that you check out The Rules of the Game, the Jean Renoir film from 1939, which helped to define this genre of class-oriented, witty murder mysteries. And that's a great film. That's superbly made.
Is it better than either of these?
It's a lot better than either of these movies. It's one of the great movies of all time. It has its own problems, culturally, and it's not a real murder mystery. And that's what really makes it work, is that, spoiler alert for the movie, the death is a surprise at the end. But what it does do is more unflinchingly both present the real problems of class in these environments and not turn it into, here are the villains and here are the heroes. Mm-hmm. Every character in that story has a lot of depth. So, if you like this type of movie, if you like old movies, if you like French movies, I do really recommend that, although it has its own problems as well.
Okay, so I think that's all either of us has to say about either of these films. Yes?
Sure, yeah.
So now moving on to, did we watch these in the right order? So we watched Gosford Park and then Knives Out. We had both seen Gosford Park before, several times. Mm-hmm. And you had seen Knives Out before, but this was my first Knives Out. And this was also only your second Knives Out. And watching a murder mystery the second time is such a different experience that your first time and your second time are really unique experiences. And then third through fourth are more similar.
And I want to give credit to you for sort of getting me to watch Knives Out, because that all came from your recommendation of a really good YouTube essay, which you might want to check out, maybe by Rowan Ellis. I can't quite remember the title of the essay now. It's Rage and Revenge. Good for Her, The Birth of a New Genre. That's right. I can't remember exactly what the title is, but something along those lines, which is about a whole recent set of movies, including Knives Out, about women characters who discover the ability to defeat oppression by not playing within the rules of the system, which this movie partially succeeds at, I think partially fails at. So thanks for getting me on the right track by recommending that essay to me. Yes, if you want more, go and watch Rowan's video essay. It's a good one. So for did we watch these in the right order? I would say, if you still haven't watched either of these films, I totally respect you. And inspiring that you've been able to follow what we're saying. Before watching either of these films, if you haven't seen any classic golden age, seen or read any classic golden age mysteries, what's one movie you'd recommend as an example? Like you don't know murder mysteries that much. What's a good choice? Yeah, I'd probably say watch one Sherlock Holmes and one Agatha Christie. For your Sherlock Holmes, my favorite Sherlock Holmes series is the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes television series from the 70s. I would probably go for The Blue Carbuncle. You don't need to watch Sherlock Holmes stories in order. They're all they're kind of one-offs. Yeah. So The Blue Carbuncle is a Christmas mystery. It's not a murder mystery. It's a theft of a jewel mystery. Okay. And it's kind of light and fun. Mm-hmm. If you want something grittier, Hound of the Baskervilles is a classic, and you should know what's going on in Hound of the Baskervilles. Agatha Christie. So Agatha Christie's most famous work is Murder on the Orient Express. I don't think Murder on the Orient Express is very good. It's not great. There is a recent film of it that's done in a more modern style, so that's an option. I just think it's a bad mystery. I think it's a stupid crime that never would actually have happened. So I would probably go for just whatever the first episode of the Geraldine McEwen Miss Marples is. I don't know which one that is, but at some point I've seen it, and it's good. I think it's the only thing I remember about it is the resolution, so I can't actually say. Well, it's the first episode. But yeah, Geraldine McEwen as Miss Marple. Great. So yeah, to the question of what did we watch in the right order, because we watched it for this series, first Gosford Park, then we watched Knives Out. And I would say personally, that is definitely the right order. Because in both cases, the films are sort of commenting on the murder mystery genre as established before. And I think to a certain extent, Knives Out is directly sort of a response or a continuation of Gosford Park. Again, we see the maid character, for lack of a better term. And I don't like calling Marta a maid. That's right. She's one of the most educated people in the show. I mean, she's kind of treated like a maid. The personal servant, for lack of that, that's what the movie's about. So the sort of similar character. Similar names, Marta and Mary. Yeah, Marta is not a very different character than Mary, and I'm willing to say that's frankly a pretty intentional pastiche. So I believe Knives Out is a commentary on Gosford Park, or a continuation on it. So I would definitely recommend watching them in that order. And what I really agree with your point that it might, if you haven't seen any murder mysteries really, then that helps too. And the order that I would really maybe think about to watching it would be Rules of the Game, then Hounds of the Baskervilles, then Gosford Park, then Knives Out. I feel like that would give you the full, both the sort of artistic perspective and a little bit more of the cultural and media perspective. That would help. If you feel like you already kind of know the murder mystery genre and the upstairs downstairs thing, and that's something you're pretty comfortable with, then I think watching Gosford Park and then Knives Out would be great.
Yeah, I will say, if you're coming at this from like a media literacy perspective, that's the correct angle. If you're coming at this from like a vibes and how am I going to feel at the end perspective, I would watch them the other way around. And especially if you've already seen them, because Gosford Park has a hopeful ending. You know, it's Mary,
unjustified,
whether it makes sense or not, Mary's doing better, and Elsie's going off to a great life.
Fair.
Whereas the final tone of Knives Out is victorious in what I don't think they wanted to
domineering,
but which ended up as being a sort of sinister victory.
Yeah, it's tricky because I think Knives Out is intended to have a much happier ending than Gosford Park, which is sort of presented as a mixed bag of a complex, whereas in Knives Out it's supposed to be this total victory. But I think you're right that in Gosford Park we're very happy for how things work out, and we feel like, okay, this is not perfect, but we do see an improvement at every level in some ways. Where in Knives Out, maybe you do really find that inspiring, and you know that's a perspective. But to me, it almost is the reverse of its intention. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so that's the end of the meat of this episode. Now we are going to turn it over to you. This is our call for recommendations for double features. So we, of course, have a very long list of movies that we want to get to, of double features, and a couple of triple features that we want to get to. But if you guys have any recommendations, obviously we're limited by films that we've already seen and know about, and there's plenty of films that we have neither seen nor know about. Sort of what we're looking for is generally films by different directors.
We're especially looking for cases where different directors effectively were trying to make the same movie with a lot of the same intentions and a lot of the same devices. Yeah,
so multiple points of connection. So here we had murder mysteries from the servant's point of view, attempting to revitalize the genre.
With both a poison and a knife.
Yeah, with sort of multiple vectors of death. So we're getting like both plot similarities and like meta production similarities. In our first episode with Children's Hour and Teen Sympathy, they're both set in a school, and they're about people who are being accused of homosexuality. The films were made very close to each other in time, and they're both based on a Broadway play. So we're looking for things with multiple points of contact. We're also, don't want to be condescending, but we're looking for like good movies. So I don't think we're
movies that at least want to be good, that are attempting to bring some real art and finely crafted filmmaking, that are not just genre films or mass media films.
Yeah, so I don't think we're probably ever going to do a Marvel Cinematic Universe movie. And I'll also say for me, I'm not going to watch anything that is really horror based. You know, things like Pan's Labyrinth, the film that we call The Vavitch, which is the one with Anya Taylor-Joy.
That's kind of the edge.
Yeah, that's the edge. And also, sometimes we may come to you with a particular film that we are looking for a double feature for.
Or maybe you could suggest a film that you're really interested in, and we could find the right double feature for that.
Yeah. So leave your suggestions in the comments. Even though we have a huge list, we don't really have a particular order. We've decided that the way we're going to approach this is we're just going to pick whatever pairing we are most excited about in the moment, because you'd much rather hear us talk about something we're excited about than something that we're sort of not in the mood for at that time.
Thanks so much for sharing episode 2 with us. It's a great experience to do the podcast, and it's great to talk about the movies.
I agree.